Welcome to the sound of resistance. Russian troops began to withdraw towards the Ukrainian borders as the Ukrainian army continued to achieve incredible victories on the country's eastern and southern fronts. The brave Ukrainian army has so far recaptured an area of approximately 8,000 square kilometers from the Russians with covered-down operations under the leadership of Ukrainian President Zelensky. Zelensky's Lions advanced as far as the Crimea and pinned the enemy in this area. The Russian army no longer had the strength to withstand the pressures of the Ukrainian army. The inadequacy of weapons and other military equipment has brought morale down in the Russian army. The fact that the Russian administration did not take any steps in this regard also caused the soldiers in the Russian troops to lose their faith in the war. In the Russian army, news of Russian soldiers who committed suicide or fled from the front were shaking the agenda every day. There had been serious uprisings in the Russian army in the past few days. There was a lack of communication and armed fights between both high-ranking Russian soldiers and other personnel in the army. Members of the military blame Russian leader Vladimir Putin as the cause of all the fighting and noise. While the situation in Russia was so dire, the lives of Russian soldiers were meaningless to the Russian administration, and the cards containing the secret code handed out by the Ukrainian army to the Russian soldiers fell like a bomb on the world's agenda. Now, a way of salvation has been opened for the Russian soldiers. The merciful Ukrainian army began to distribute cards with QR codes on the back to Russian soldiers who wanted to surrender. There are secret codes on these cards which indicate that if the Russian soldiers lay down their weapons and surrender, they will be sent home safely. Of course, how these soldiers will take shelter with their families in Russia under Putin's leadership after surrendering is another issue. Along with the surrender process, Ukrainian and Western intelligence units may accompany the families of the soldiers to leave Russia. Such a process was followed for the Russian soldiers who escaped from the oppressive government and took refuge in the West during the Soviet Union period. Another method could be to hide these surrendered Russian soldiers under the control of the Ukrainian administration by shoving them as missing until the end of the war. The QR codes of these new surrender cards, which have a Russian message, have a content describing how the Russian soldiers surrendered. The terms of surrender stated in the content are that Russian soldiers must completely abandon their weapons and take refuge in the Ukrainian army with white flags and indicate the names, surnames, and military identities of the soldiers who will surrender. At the bottom of the QR codes, on the back of the card, there's a contact number for the Russian soldiers who will surrender. The front of the card is covered with the colors of the Ukrainian flag. The message on the front reads in Russian, "Your ticket to a peaceful life." Again, on the front of the card, at the bottom, there is a detailed information for the Russian soldiers who want to surrender. Surrender cards guarantee amnesty to all Russian soldiers who voluntarily lay down their arms and hand over any military equipment to Ukraine. The Ukrainian armed forces are telling any Ukrainian soldier that if Russian army soldiers show these cards, they will be delivered safely to their home. More than half of the soldiers in the Russian army state in the messages they share on social media that they have seen the mercy that they have not seen from Putin from the Ukrainian army. Thanks to the surrender cards of the Ukrainian armed forces containing secret codes, some Russian soldiers hoped for their lives. In fact, most Russian soldiers in the army now want to return home. Dissatisfied with the course of the war, starving and thirsty for lack of opportunities, Russian soldiers think that the Kremlin and Putin do not care about them. Putin's attitude, on the other hand, justifies the Russian soldiers to a great extent. In the past weeks, when the losses of the Russian army due to the war were so high, Russian leader Putin celebrated the opening of Europe's largest Ferris wheel with fireworks displays. The Russian leader, who received a great reaction after this incident, was accused of hiding the losses of his army from his people. Neither the Kremlin nor Putin ever talked about the lives of the Russian army in the war and the military supplies it lost. Putin, who even played the Russian media on his finger, was broadcasting fake news that the war was progressing very well in favor of Russia. But some Russian media channels could no longer stand Putin's delusion, and for the first time, dared to say that Russia was in a tragic defeat. Most news pages state that Ukraine's compassionate army cares more about Russian soldiers than Putin does. Russian leader Putin has not yet made a statement about the Ukrainian army's distribution of secret code delivery cards to Russian soldiers. The Russian government, which has been thoroughly discredited in the eyes of the army and the Russian people, is now only watching its own army being saved by the Ukrainian heroes. The photos of the cards distributed by the Ukrainian army, which created an earthquake effect on the agenda, were first shared on social media by the governor of the Mykolaiv region in the south of Ukraine, Vitaly Kim. Many war experts say that these cards distributed by the Ukrainian army will affect the duration of the war and will save many Russian soldiers who want to surrender from the attack and die policy adopted by Putin. If the soldiers of the Russian army surrender with these cards, it is estimated that the war will not be too fierce in Crimea and its surroundings. According to British intelligence reports, the Ukrainian army has recently seized 140 million worth of Russian military equipment. This equipment includes approximately 40 tanks, nearly 50 armored transport vehicles, 20 armored personnel carriers, and 100 armored rescue vehicles. Although the losses of the Russian army are listed even by most of the world countries, the surrender cards issued by Ukraine may prevent Putin from harming Russia by still continuing the war. Many of the Russian soldiers captured so far say that their commanders deserted them. Captured Russian soldiers state that there are thousands of soldiers in the Russian army who are willing to surrender. Especially after the victories in the south and the east of Ukraine, the number of Russian soldiers who did not want to fight and wanted to escape from the front increased, and the Russian administration threatened to declare the Russian soldiers who opposed the war as traitors, a strategy befitting Putin. In addition, Russian soldiers captured by the Ukrainian armed forces revealed that the Ukrainian people, despite being tortured and oppressed by the Russians, are still providing food and water to the Russian soldiers who are starving and thirsty. It is clearly understood in the statements they made that some of the captured Russian soldiers regretted and how merciful the Ukrainian people were. The brave army of such compassionate Ukraine is showing the world what it can be like to fight with honor by opening its arms to Russian soldiers who will oppose the war and surrender. Ukraine's leader Zelensky, on the other hand, has been an exemplary leader for everyone by never giving up his determination no matter what happened from the beginning of the war. The war was initially a nightmare for the Ukrainians. The Russian army was attacking everywhere indiscriminately. Dozens of innocent Ukrainian civilians were dying every day. Schools, hospitals, and theater buildings in Ukraine were bombed by the Russian army. The Russian administration was in no way refraining from committing war crimes. There was nothing in the name of human rights, but Ukraine did not give up. The heroic leader Zelensky recaptured nearly 90% of the lands occupied by the Russians, thanks to the partial liberation operations he planned. Now the Ukrainian leader Zelensky forgives the Russian soldiers despite all the torture, oppression, and persecution of the Russian soldiers.